time. Okay, it says that we are live. Hey guys, it's Ellie in space. I'm still here in Florida and I wanted to find a better Wi Fi situation, hence why I'm at the Panera. So, enjoy the sunshine, I guess. But I am joined by Jean with DongFang Hour. We spoke almost exactly a year ago, and you are an expert in Chinese space.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't call myself an expert, but I definitely spent a lot of time looking at what's happening and sharing that on the YouTube channel. Thank you very much for inviting me, by the way.
Yeah, I just feel like, it made sense to get a yearly update because so much has happened, including most recently the Chinese space station. So maybe you want to start there?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. So I think that's probably the biggest highlight of this year is China completing its space station, and so the space station is the end game of a very long project that was started in the early '90s. It's called Project 921. 921 because it was started in 1992. And the idea was to have a permanent space station in space, and since the very beginning. And this was a three-phase project. There was the first phase where the Chinese were getting familiar and trying to build the basic technology building blocks. You know, a human-rated rocket. A crewed spacecraft, Shenzhou, the equivalent of a Dragon a spacecraft. There was a second phase, getting familiar with technologies such as docking, rendezvous. Building their own indigenous spacesuit, things like that. So we're in the mid 2000s, early 2010s, a cargo spacecraft, life support systems. And since last year, we're in this final phase where China is building the actual space station. So this started in 2021 with the core module that's called Tianhe. That was launched in April 2021, if I remember correctly. And then we have the two experimental modules. That were launched this year, so in July and at the end of October this year. And so the core module last year was sort of this command center where where you have the sleeping quarters of the astronauts. It's where they'll be eating, where they'll be doing sports. It's the command center. So there's a little bit less science there. And then you have the two experimental modules that were launched this year, and that represent where the space science will be taking place. And so it's all been assembled actually a couple of weeks ago, and where normally the end of the construction phase would be either at the end of this year or very early next year, where the astronauts would have made sure that everything is working nominally, and so then they can move back from all of that and then focus on space sciences. So in a nutshell, we can go into details on anything if you want.
Yeah. And it's pronounced Tiangong. Is that correct?
So there are three names actually, and they all refer to the same thing. You have Chinese Space Station, you have CSS, naturally the initials, and you have the Tiangong Space Station, Tiangong. And so those three things are the same thing. The sort of confusing thing about Tiangong is that was a name that was also used for two experimental space stations, very small ones that they sent over the past decade to sort of get familiar with various technologies. So you have Tiangong 1 and Tiangong 2. That's different from the Tiangong space station, which is the current one, the bigger one.
Okay, okay. And what does Tiangong mean?
It means the palace in the sky. It's very
Oh,
poetic.
cool. Oh, I love that. And for those who are unfamiliar, it's like a fifth of the size of the ISS, correct?
So we're looking at, so each of the three modules that were sent have a mass of roughly 20 tons. So we're talking about 60 tons. And if you add also the sort of spacecraft that are docked to it, that's probably 80 to 90 tons. I think the ISS is around 400 tons. So yeah, roughly, something like 20-ish% of the ISS. Although there are plans to expand it in the future over the next 10 years to 180 tons. That would be sort of the extended version of the CSS. And then we're talking about roughly half the CSS.
Right. Looks like the Wi-Fi is getting a little spotty. I hope that people can still hear us. Um, yeah, and so tell me what else is going on. I mean, you said it's been a very busy year. I know. I was interested too to hear kind of about the Chinese SpaceX that you were describing to me?
So, yeah, that's a very good question, and it's a question that the Chinese ask themselves also, like, who is going to be the Chinese SpaceX? And the reason for that is that, so for some context for your viewers, if they're not entirely familiar with the Chinese space sector, this was something that was very state-owned and still is to a very large extent. It's a sector that's controlled by the state up until 2014, and starting from 2014, which is sort of an arbitrary date, it the country started opening up its space sector to private capital, to entrepreneurs, to private companies, and that's when we started seeing a lot of startups being founded by people who are leaving these state-owned companies to start their own company. And so, in terms of launch companies, we have maybe 15 to 20 of them that have been founded since 2014, and if we define SpaceX by a company that's doing, reusable rockets, Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, vertical takeoff, vertical landing, then literally all of these Chinese companies are aspiring SpaceXs because, right from the beginning, 2015, 2016, when you looked at their roadmap, they were going directly for similar architectures, very close architectures. And it was a period where in Europe, for example, people were still asking, is reusability the way to go? Is it economically viable? You also had the same debate within Chinese state-owned enterprises, but among the commercial companies, however, it seemed like, they were embracing this Elon Musk SpaceX approach. And so all of them literally are having this two-stage rocket with roughly 9 engines disposed in a circle, one central engine, and taking off and having the first stage land vertically. Now, none of them have accomplished this yet. It's still in development, but you have a couple of ones that are really close to it. You have maybe some names that may be familiar to some of you, like Landspace, iSpace, Galactic Energy, Deep Blue Aerospace. These are companies that are either on the verge of having their maiden launch. That's the case of Landspace next month, but that will be the rocket will be expendable at the beginning, and others which are doing sort of what SpaceX was doing in the early 2010s with the Grasshoppers, or this first stage that would be doing hops that would be increasingly higher in altitude. So that's the current situation. So who is going to be the Chinese SpaceX, I think, is more a question of who is going to survive, because 15 to 20 companies, launch companies, everyone agrees that is. I mean, this is even an opinion coming from the Chinese, right? That's way too many companies for the current demand.
Yeah.
So there will be consolidations, there'll be bankruptcies probably, and out of all of that, it's very likely that maybe 2 or 3 launch companies will be sort of the emerging commercial launch companies, launch service providers in China.
Well, I want to thank John Kimball because he is just dropping questions left and right. So let's start digging into those. He wants to know, do you see an increase in U.S., let me pull it up there, China cooperation in space? And I feel like a lot of people probably have that question.
Honestly, probably not, because first of all, we're in a situation where U.S.-China cooperation is pretty much at rock bottom. There's the Wolf Amendment in the U.S., which makes it nearly impossible for NASA to have any sort of collaboration with the Chinese. And politics has a very important role in international collaboration in space. And since today, the trust, you need to have trust to start having these cooperations, and it's just not there between the US and China at the moment. And you see this in public statements from NASA's administrator on, for example, the uncontrolled reentry of the first stage of Long March 5B a couple of weeks ago, things like that. And so it's relations aren't good, and I don't see them getting better at the moment. So probably not with the US. However, if we expand the question to Western countries, I think there is an interest definitely to have increased cooperation between European partners of NASA, so ESA and various national space agencies in Europe, There's already existing cooperation, notably around space sciences between Europe and China. And Europe has this very long tradition of being part of programs, providing key subsystems for like the Artemis program and the International Space Station. And I think this is where they also have an interest for the Chinese space station, and potentially also the ILRS, which is this sort of Sino-Russian-led lunar station that's going to exist in the take shape in the 2030s. So I could see Europe and non-US Western countries maybe playing a role in collaborating with China on these projects. Again, politics is international relations is a very important factor, I think, that can change things very rapidly. And as we saw, with Russia, right, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you've seen a lot of most European collaborations with Russia just getting canceled. And so if things for some reason don't go well with China, that could also could disappear as well. Yeah.
Well, here's another question from John, and you may or may not know the answer. How does India's emerging space program and future plans compare to China?
Oh, so that's a hard one for me because I'm not that familiar with the Indian space program, but I do know that they also have some very strong ambitions going from lunar exploration to crewed space flight. So can't really make the one-on-one comparison here, fortunately.
Right. It's all right. We got more questions. Oki wants to know, when the orbit is lifted, does it use integrated boosters, or like the ISS is an external ship that has to be docked?
So which spacecraft or rocket are we referring to here?
They might be talking about the space station if they're comparing it to the ISS, maybe.
So the space station has a wide range of methods to control its orbit. So you have actual thrusters using hypergolic fuel, and so if you look at a picture of the Chinese space station, you'll see nozzles in all directions. These are either for attitude control, or you have the more powerful ones with larger nozzles and that are directed, that are sort of coaxial with the space station, that are for orbital control. You also have some Hall effect thrusters, so electric power thrusters at the back of the Tianhe core module. That's a first for a crewed spacecraft, for a space station, that are at the back of the Tianhe core module. That's for orbital control. And the advantage of electric propulsion is that it's something that's significantly more efficient compared to chemical propulsion. And you also have CMGs, control moment gyroscopes. It's these 6 spheres that you have on the Tianhe core module. You also have 6 on the Wentian experimental module, and these are disks that are spinning extremely fast, and by changing their sort of their momentum, by pivoting them, by turning them, you can sort of orientate the space station in different directions. So that's for attitude control. And so it uses a combination of all of this to control its attitude and its orbit. And you also have incoming spacecraft like Shenzhou, the Tianzhou, which are the crewed and the cargo spacecraft. They can use their own thrusters to help the space station move around. And that's because when you're docking, you're at the edge of the space station. Sometimes you have more leverage to turn it around than if maybe your systems, your thrusters, are closer to the center of gravity. So various methods. I'm not sure that was the exact answer to the question, but there you go. It's some info.
If you guys need to clarify, you can just drop a comment. But we have another question from John, and I actually have this question too. Is China working on their own version of Starlink, or is that a fear for them? They want to know.
So Starlink, that's a good question. Is there a Chinese Starlink?
Yeah.
So the Chinese had 2 broadband communication constellations planned in the late 2010s. It was called Hongyun and Hongyan, and they were led by 2 of the largest space conglomerates in China, CASIC and CASC, so a few hundred satellites each, if I remember correctly. And so around 2018, there were some test satellites that were launched. And so probably there was a lot of, engineering and research and development that was done during that sort of with that prototype that was launched. But these two constellations then were unheard of in the early 2020s. And it was also, on an entirely different scale compared to what Starlink was doing, which is the number of satellites that you have in, Starlink's constellation. And there was also the fact that it didn't necessarily make sense to have two domestic constellations competing. That just seemed quite inefficient. And so what we've been seeing since the early 2020s is that these two constellations would be sort of merged into this new constellation that is seemingly called Guowang. I'm not sure it's the official name, but it's the name that's used in the Chinese press quite often. It means national network. And it's this constellation would have presumably 13,000 satellites in orbit. So that would be sort of the Chinese equivalent of Starlink. And
Right.
what's interesting about it, I think, is that while it's a state-owned project for sure, what the Chinese did was that they created a company called China Satnet that would manage this this constellation. But rather than sort of having the existing company China Satcom, which manages China's geostationary communication satellites, rather than having this company manage the Chinese Starlink, they created this new company that was independent from existing space companies, and that meant that China Satnet would have the liberty, I believe, to source their space hardware, however they would like. And so that's potentially opportunities for commercial companies to start providing space hardware for this massive constellation. So that's sort of a different practice compared to before, where everything was state-owned.
Right.
So yeah, short answer, China is working on their own version of Starlink.
I'm not sure, maybe you'll understand this question. Mike Salty Sailor wants to know, how is their real estate market going to affect their space program?
Oh, yeah, right. Because there's a real estate crisis currently in China,
Yeah.
and so that's affecting their economy. So I think that China considers its space program as critical infrastructure. So, I mean, I have no doubt that the space program is not going to suffer, at least for now, from any economic, downturns that it would be experiencing. And so I'm pretty confident that there wouldn't be too much of an effect. Now, would it would it affect the commercial companies? That remains to be seen, because commercial companies, they do depend on on investment from venture capital firms, from local governments. And so if you have the revenue from real estate that's going down and that's affecting typically local government funding, that's something that potentially could affect them, and that would push these commercial space companies to try and commercialize as early as possible and not rely on too much private and public funding. So yes and no, I guess.
Let's talk about, I feel like I've seen multiple headlines in just the last year since we've talked, about, for example, Chinese rocket body breaks up in orbit after successful satellite launch. So what's going on with this debris that is being created when this happens? And is this quite irresponsible?
So yeah, that's a very good question. I made a video on this because it's a very confusing matter.
Right.
Just to describe what the Chinese practice at the moment is, that you have the Long March 5B, which is China's largest rocket, Long March 5 family, that launches bits of space station pieces into orbit. So Tianhe, Mengtian, Wentian, all those bits that were launched last year and this year were by the Long March 5B. The Long March 5B is the version of the Long March 5 that's optimized for LEO. And so it's what the Chinese call one stage and a half. So you have one core stage, you have 4 side boosters, but you don't have a second stage. So the core stage has the role of the second stage as well. And so it will take the payload and insert it into orbit. And so it will have orbital or near orbital velocity. And that's unlike, a 2-stage rocket, for example, the 2-stage version of Long March 5. It's the second stage that brings the payload into whatever orbit. And the issue with Long March 5B is that, well, when your stage reaches orbital velocity, then the decaying and the atmospheric reentry takes a lot more time and becomes significantly more literally unpredictable. And so the ideal practice would have been for sure to perform a controlled reentry, and so use various systems. It can be thrusters, it can be other systems to make sure that your rocket breaks up in an area that's not going to generate damage. And so this is not something that's done for the Long March 5B. And so it performs an uncontrolled reentry. Now you have other spacecraft doing uncontrolled reentry, so it's not the uncontrolled reentry that much that's creating problems. It's more the fact that it's this second stage, this first stage, this core stage is huge. So we're talking about a 20-ton piece of space junk that's reentering. And so if you have 1 ton reentering, that maybe most of it breaks up, and so you're fine. 20 tons, we're starting to look at significant risks. And I think the Aerospace Corporation had, made some probably very complex calculations to reach the estimate of between 1 chance out of 250 and 1 chance out of 1,000 that such a reentry would generate either damage to property or to people. And so that's below what is, that's much higher than what's considered the the general standard. I think it's NASA's standard of 1 out of 10,000. You need to have a lower risk than 1 in 10,000 for things to go forward. Now, I also try to put things in a little bit of context, because this is a rocket that's not planned to be launched many times, right? And so if you launch this rocket, if you take a rocket that has 1 chance out of 100 to cause damage, but you launch it once, I believe that you have the same risk as if you launch 100 times a rocket that has 1 chance out of 10,000 of creating damage. And so I think the Chinese approach was, this rocket, we're just launching it 4 times. And so, if you look at the number of launches times the risk, then it's acceptable. I think that's their viewpoint. So it'll depend on the viewer's opinion here on if that's acceptable or not. But yeah, I think that's their approach. And I think this rocket was designed in the late 2000s, early 2010s, where maybe there wasn't that much awareness, I would guess, on the damage generated by space debris, at least in China. And so I think it's a much more sensitive topic today. So I don't see the Chinese doing the same thing for future rockets, because honestly, it's having a devastating effect on their reputation abroad. There are a lot of and so I am sure they're going to change. That's not going to happen probably for their future rockets. I did see in recent weeks that they said they would be using the Long March 5B, modifying it to enable it to launch constellations. And so then we're not talking about just 3 to 4 launches, right? We're talking about many more launches. And so I think hopefully for them, either they fix this issue, or it's going to have, again, a very bad effect on their reputation. But I think what they're going to do to enable it to launch constellations or other payloads into low Earth orbit is to add a second stage, or sort of an upper stage, an existing one called the Yuanzhong engines. And so I would believe that with this engine, that would mean that the core stage would not be reaching orbital velocity, and it'd be much more predictable in terms of where this core stage would break up, especially since this rocket is launching from the coastal launch site of Wenchang. So it's over the sea, similar to Florida. You're launching over the sea. And so if you have your core stage, your first stage that's suborbital, you can predict that it's going to land in the sea and not just
Well, even with this most recent headline about the Long March 6A, I believe, breaking up, it created 50 pieces of debris. So does something like that threaten Starlink?
So I read, definitely that the Long March 6A, the fact that it sort of broke up, created over 50 trackable pieces of debris. And so for sure, I believe those pieces are between, or at least at the time when I saw the news, between 400 and 700 kilometers of altitude. And so that's definitely an altitude where you're in low Earth orbit. So you'd have a lot of satellites. So I
Right.
don't know if Starlink is as high as 400 to 700 kilometers. I would believe they're a bit lower than that. So maybe not a risk for Starlink, but you're in a very crowded region, so definitely not a good practice. But I mean, I think that that breakup was an accident that either took place
Yeah.
before the passivation of the rocket, or maybe the passivation went wrong. And so I think that the more worrying thing is not the fact that I mean, accidents happen, and so that's uncool, but that's what it is. It's more the fact that very little people are talking about it in China, on the Chinese Twitter, on Weibo, and I think that's the issue. It's that it's not being treated either in the media or on social media as a problem. And so when you don't raise the awareness on, what the issues that these accidents create, well, they're
Right.
bound to, maybe happen again. Yeah.
Yeah, totally. And let's see here. We have a question from Making Humanity Multiplanetary with Dana. Do you run your videos from within China? And I know the answer is no.
Exactly. No, I'm based in Paris. So just some background maybe quickly on the channel.
Yeah, please,
Dongfang
please.
Hour is sort of it's a side hustle. It's a hobby. I actually have a full-time job in aviation, which has nothing to do with space. Space is sort of a passion, and since I've lived quite a few years in Chinese-speaking areas, I read and write and speak Chinese. This enables me to sort of really get into the firsthand information on Chinese space. And so this is more of a hobby of sharing things online, but I'm not based in China, at least not at the moment. But why not in the future to be able to be on the field, on the ground, and to share things hands-on
Right.
launches. That'd be very cool, like Ellie's doing here.
Yeah. Yeah. I am curious, where are you from originally?
So I'm French, as my name would suggest, Jean Deville. But I lived many years in Taipei. That's where also I got my English accent, because
Yeah.
I was there, there's a lot of Americans in Taiwan, and so that's where I got my English at a young
Oh,
age. But then I lived after most of my life in France, where I studied aerospace engineering, started working, and also spent quite a few years in China. 3 to 4 years working, and also university exchanges. So
yeah.
yeah.
I thought maybe you grew up in the States because you don't. I mean, you sound like you grew up learning and speaking English. So that's interesting. I had no idea.
No, English is my second language.
Wow. Okay. So is French your first?
Yeah, that's correct.
Oh, wow, that's crazy. All right, answer the next one in French. I'm kidding. Uh, um, Ismail wants to know, how does China plan to improve the safety record of their rockets? So, like, are there any plans in the works to kind of help this poor reputation to the rest of us out here? That
So there are several things, three points that I could highlight here with this question. So there's the uncontrolled reentry of the Long March 5B specifically. That doesn't have very good press outside of China, and so as we already discussed, I think that they would be fixing this once they use the Long March 5B for regular deployments. I think that they didn't take this into account in the design initially, when they thought that they'd just be launching the rocket a couple of
yeah,
times. But yeah, definitely not a good practice for sure. And then there's the fact that today their launch sites, they have 3 launch sites that are inland, and quite often you have first stages of rockets that come back down on Chinese territory. And so since these pieces are suborbital, their trajectory is more or less predictable. And so the villages are evacuated in advance to make sure there isn't any harm to the population. But again, still not a good practice to have bits of rockets, hitting your villages and your cities. I think there's a historical reason for this. I mean, they don't do this for the pleasure of getting bad press. It's because these launch sites were built historically, in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s, and so we're in the Cold War. China doesn't have very friendly relations, neither with the Soviet Union or with the U.S. And so, as China was very weak back then, its military was weak. It built its launch sites inland to keep them safe, as it was considered, national security for national security reasons. And so that's why they are there. But the future is definitely either using as much as possible their coastal launch sites. So right now there's only the Wenchang Launch Center, but they're expanding it. They're building currently a commercial launch site to enable commercial companies to launch from the sea. You have you also have a couple of launches in the province of Shandong in the northeast, where they're doing sea launch, basically taking small solid rockets and launching it from the sea. And there's also a launch site that's supposed to be built in Xiangshan. So we're in Zhejiang province. We're not that far from Shanghai. And so a coastal launch site is scheduled to be built there. And so I think that's the future. There's such a demand for launch at the moment in China that they definitely aren't able to close down or reduce the cadence of the launches with the landlocked launch sites. But moving forward, what they've been testing is sort of incorporating parachutes on the fairings, or the various stages, to slow the crashing, the debris coming back to the ground, and also reducing the uncertainty radius to make sure that they have a better understanding of where it's going to land. They've also installed in the past grid fins on some of the Long March. I believe there's a Long March 2D and there was a Long March 4 also. I think that had this basically not to land vertically as SpaceX does, but it's more to have a controlled reentry, because with grid fins you can control a little bit more the trajectory. So they're trying these different things to minimize the impact. And so the last point I want to mention regarding the safety record is reliability of the rockets. And so from that perspective, Chinese rockets are definitely fairly reliable. I mean, if you look at the success, the failure rate, it's definitely among international standards. So I think from that perspective, they're doing well. And it's really a comeback compared to a period in the 90s where there was a very poor track record. Today, they're more at the forefront of reliability rather than trailing behind.
Well, and G Tian wants to know, can John discuss the Chinese sources that you use to track all these developments?
Sure. So I don't have any inside information. All I get is basically I read the Chinese press. I use a lot Chinese social media tools. So WeChat is a very good tool. So WeChat is, I don't know how to describe it. It's sort of an app that is a mix of WhatsApp, but also of Twitter and of Facebook. And so you get a lot of information that's there. You can also there's something that's called WeChat official accounts, which is sort of like websites, but inside WeChat, that a lot of companies have. So you can just follow a little bit what these companies are doing. They post regular updates. Weibo is a good tool. Weibo is the Chinese Twitter. And so you have a lot of leading people on Twitter that talk about space, about, Western space developments. You have the equivalent on Weibo talking about Chinese space. So, I mean, just by reading and following what these guys are saying, and by reading the Chinese press, you can really get a lot of information. So that's the main source of information. And basically, I also talk with the co-founder of DongFang Hour, Blaine Curcio, who was interviewed also last year. He's directly working. He has a consulting company he's based in Hong Kong, and he also works in relation with the Chinese space sector. So talking with him also is extremely enlightening. Basically, it's mostly sources that are out there. Unfortunately, I don't have inside information that I can share.
Yeah, and good thing you can read that press, because that's why we look to you, because I certainly could not.
And the thing is, you can use Google Translate, which works fairly well, but you get things that are lost in translation. You read I sometimes just scan through it in English, because I read English faster than Chinese. So to get the main ideas, and then sometimes like, oh, what does this mean? It probably doesn't mean what it's saying in English here. Switch it back to Chinese, and you realize, okay, yeah, it's meant something completely different. Google Translate can help you. It's not perfect though.
This is kind of a sidebar, but how hard was it to learn Mandarin?
It was a challenge. So I was in Taiwan when I was quite small, and so the young age helps pick up the language quite a bit. But then I spent a full year just learning Chinese when I was around 21, 22. I just went to Taipei 6 months, went to Beijing 6 months, and just studied the language intensively. They have these courses where you do 20 or 25 hours of Mandarin per week, and that definitely helped a lot.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Epic Guest wants to know, forgive me for not knowing, and this is a real question. The Long March is their mission name, but what is the Chinese end goal?
So the Long March is not really a mission name. It's the name of their series of rockets that are manufactured by CASC, which is the Chinese Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation. It's the largest space conglomerate. They name most of their rockets Long March. Long March is a name that refers to this historical event in the 1930s where the Communist Party during the Chinese Civil War sort of retreated, and it's part of the China's Communist Party's lore. And so these rockets were were designed initially in the Long March 1 in the 60s, and so it's a period where they were naming a lot of things after very communist names, so Long March, and that's why they're called Long March. This is not that much to practice today now. And so that's what the Long March is. What's the end game of China's space program? I think it's quite similar to the end game that you'd have with other space powers. There's naturally, I think, space sciences, space exploration. There's also national prestige. Having a strong space program is something that's definitely that can be to the credit of the incumbent government. It's something that can also be used to stimulate, young Chinese people to go towards jobs like, of being engineers or scientists. Sort of the Apollo effect that you also had in the U.S. in the 60s. And so there, wide variety of reasons. It's also, space is critical infrastructure that can be linked to national security. There are so many applications to space today that there's not one end game. It's more a wide variety of applications. And China is one of the few countries today that has really the means and the budget to have an end-to-end space program where they're basically involved in almost any type of spacecraft that you could think of.
Right. This is an interesting question from FMC123. Is it possible for an astronaut on the ISS to go to the CSS in an emergency like it was shown in a movie? I'm not sure what movie they're talking about, but...
So I think that would be Gravity. I think that's how Gravity ends. Like, is it like the astronauts get into a Shenzhou spacecraft? I don't remember.
Haven't seen it, which sounds like a crime.
So that's a good question. I don't know. Probably not. I would think, but I'm definitely not an expert of how if an astronaut could get into a Dragon spacecraft and then get into the Chinese space station's orbits. I think the orbit inclination of the CSS is lower than that of the ISS. So I'm not sure. However, if we modify a little bit the question, is it possible for an astronaut of the ISS to get into the CSS? Is it possible for a non-Chinese astronaut to get into the CSS? That's something that the Chinese are very much looking forward to. And so they're head of their crewed spaceflight program mentioned that basically once China's passed the construction phase of the Chinese space station, which is ending at the end of this year, basically they're looking forward to have foreign astronauts on board. They would naturally, there'd be Russia probably that'd be very interested as they're now withdrawing from the International Space Station. The issue with Russia is that their launch site, it's not at a latitude that enables them to launch their Soyuz to the Chinese space station. So they would have to launch from Chinese spacecraft and Chinese launch centers. Now, I'm getting into a rabbit hole here, but their spacecraft, the Chinese crewed spacecraft Shenzhou, has a close similarity with the Soyuz. So probably going from one to another wouldn't be too hard, maybe. And we also know that ESA has also expressed interest in in the Chinese space station. And there have been, Chinese astronauts and European astronauts training together at two occasions over the past. I think it was in 2018. There was a training in Shandong province in China, and there's also a training that I think took place in Germany a couple of years ago. So we could see ISS astronauts on the CSS, although I don't think it would be a direct transfer from the ISS to the CSS, but I don't know for sure.
Do you ever see the Wolf Amendment being amended to encourage cooperation?
I think that even if this amendment didn't exist, I think there's such a lack of trust at the moment that I don't see any cooperation taking place. I mean, we're in a situation today where the U.S. is, increasingly worried about intellectual property theft and putting sanctions on Chinese companies, including space companies. And so that's not a sort of environment where the Chinese are going to say, let's cooperate. So, I mean, even if the U.S. were willing, the sort of economic situation today, I think makes it impossible unless there's a major shift.
So who do you think will get humans back to the moon first? I know that you guys had a spacecraft that went to the dark side of the moon in 2020, was it?
So, so that was 2018. That was the Chang'e 4 mission that went to the far side of the moon to basically the Chang'e 4 mission was a rover mission. And so there's a lander, there's a rover. The Yu-22 was the name of the rover, and that was an interesting mission because it was the first mission on the far side of the moon using a relay satellite, and so that was pretty impressive for a country that had in 2018 only 10 years of experience in in exploration beyond the Earth's orbit. Now, if we look at the current timelines, it's most definitely the U.S. I think with the Artemis program, we're talking about, if I'm not wrong, we're talking about 2025 for the first crewed lunar landing, but I'm not following day to day what's going on.
Well,
and I think that
it could, those timelines definitely could be delayed, right?
Yeah, that's what I understood. So if it's 2025, it's definitely the US first. If it's pushed back, then it could be China if it's pushed back all the way to the 2030, because China is developing a human rated rocket called the Long March 5G for lunar missions. And initially, they had been designing over the 2010s the Long March 9, which is theoretically still in development. But this super heavy rocket is taking a lot of time to develop, and potentially to accelerate their lunar exploration program. They're also developing Long March 5G, which is much smaller. We're talking about a Falcon Heavy class sort of rocket, so still fairly big for sure. And this rocket would be able to have its maiden launch in 2026, 2027. And then we'd have, normally we'd see the first crewed landing on the moon with this rocket and with their crewed spacecraft, the NGCS, which is sort of a Chinese Orion spacecraft. That's what they're saying, by 2030. So is that 2029, 2030? We don't know. But right now, the U.S. I'd say have 5 years of advance with the the date of 2025, but that can can be delayed as you mentioned.
Well, once we both get to the moon, George wants to know, I wonder how the ice water resources would be divided up on the moon if both NASA and China land at or are on it at the same time. So
I think that's an excellent question, really, because there's the Artemis program, there's also the Artemis Accords, which tend to try to establish, I guess, a baseline in terms of how lunar resources are managed. And China is not part of the Artemis Accords. And I guess each country has their own understanding of how lunar resources are supposed to be mined. And when you look at, so China, I think there was a paper that unveiled sort of where they would be landing, the potential candidate landing sites for their future Chang'e missions. And you have also NASA that revealed the candidate landing sites for the Artemis missions. And you realize that for some of them, there are overlaps. And so we could see a situation where Chinese and US missions are very close to each other. And definitely, I think there's a need to establish common rules. But there's nothing that's existing today. So I think that's an open question for sure.
Right. And you can address this and maybe give another shout out to your channel. Alan says, forgive my ignorance. WTF is Dong. It sounds like you're saying Feng, not Fang.
So Dong plus Fang here, I think. So DongFang Hour, it's a not exactly a private joke, but it's so with Blaine, we were creating a channel in the early in March 2020. It was the beginning of the epidemic. We had much more time on our hands. And previously, I was writing in a blog, China Aerospace blog, but writing wasn't that much my thing. So I switched to video, to YouTube. And at the beginning, we were thinking more of a podcast. And so that's where the hour comes from, DongFang Hour. DongFang means Eastern hour. And so, 1 hour, a podcast where we'd be talking about the East, so mainly China. But it's also a reference to the Chinese satellite platform. The first Chinese satellite is called Dongfang Hong 1. And their main satellite platforms, the geostationary ones, are called the Dongfang Hong series. And so if you look at the initials, DFH, well, Dongfang Hour is also DFH. And if you look at the logo, it's actually a small satellite that's sort of spinning around a planet, sphere, which represents a planet. So it's sort of a joke for those who get a little bit the Chinese space sector, but otherwise, yeah, it's just the name of the channel. It's reference to the Chinese space sector.
Is there anyone else doing what you're doing on YouTube, just really honing in on Chinese space?
So, sorry, I didn't catch that. Could you repeat?
Oh, is there anyone else that's just focusing on Chinese space on YouTube, or is it mainly your channel?
So you have channels in Chinese, but that's obviously not very accessible to English speaking people, and specifically on the Chinese space sector. No, I don't think so. I think maybe that's a unique position that the channel has. And I think that's one of the reasons why we went for it. I mean, space is sort of a personal hobby, a passion, and I just happened to also be interested in China and speak Chinese. And so the overlap of that is DongFang Hour, and it was also opportunistic because starting a channel today, I think for example, on the U.S. space program, that's very challenging. It's a very crowded space, and so that's why I think I went for the Chinese space sector. It also has its challenges because I think despite being the only English channel, really, I don't think it's a sector that's that popular. Like when I look at the who the YouTube algorithm is suggesting my videos to, it's a majority of people that either are mainland Chinese or have some historical connection with China. And so it's a question for me, is that the algorithm not doing things correctly, or is it just there's not that much interest in the Chinese space sector? And I think that's
right.
I think it's probably a bit of both. And I think there's also some responsibility on the Chinese side where I don't think they're very good today at marketing their own space program. I mean, it's getting better, but we're miles from what NASA is doing and all the content, that high quality content that they're putting out. And just like, it's amazing the number of space tubers that were like a couple that were, covering the live launch of Artemis and just just many launches. This is something that would be difficult. First of all, in China, you have 4 launch sites. 3 of them, I think, are really close to the public. And all 4 launch sites are military managed. Wenchang is much more open, and so you have a beach that's 5 kilometers away from the launch site, so you can have some coverage there. But just more general, I think they're not very good at marketing their space program. Unfortunately, they do have marketing, but it's very oriented towards their domestic audience, so it's not very attractive for non-Chinese speakers.
Right. And I feel like the news that I get here is like mostly negative things that happen. So
yeah, I mean, that's I definitely see that on my channel when I look through the comments. I get two type of extreme positions sometimes in the comments. I have so maybe Western viewers that say, you are a spokesperson of the Communist Party that's paying you to, provide a good image of their space sector. And I have the other way around where it's mainland Chinese viewers saying you're an American spy that's, getting
Oh
information
my
from our space program, and you're just hiding behind a content creator facade. So of course, I mean, this is the internet, so you're going to get
Right.
haters.
Oh
But
yeah.
I think behind that, I mean, the Chinese space sector, if you put the politics aside, I think it's very similar. It's a lot of people who are passionate about their job, especially since working in the space sector in China does not pay very well. So it's a lot of passion projects, people, and it's and space facilities often are very far from the city, and so people who are in the space industry quite often are people who are passionate about their jobs. And I think they just need to get their marketing together to make it a bit more likable compared to what it is now.
Maybe you can translate what Alan is saying here, because I have no idea what that is.
说得通. So yeah, like how do you translate 说得通? So like, yeah, so basically I agree. Well spoken, basically.
Okay. Yeah. That is so cool. Um, well, I told you that I would keep you around an Ellie in Space Hour. So is there anything that I missed or that you would like to add to just kind of our overall yearly update here about Chinese space? And yeah.
So, I mean, this year there was a lot happening around the Chinese space station, and less regarding space exploration. I mean, a lot was happening in 2018, Chang'e 5, Chang'e 4, sorry, and then in 2020, 2021, you had the Chang'e 5 mission sample return, lunar sample return. You had the Tianwen-1 mission, which is still active today on Mars with their Mars rover. So this year, 2022, was a bit more calm, although those rivers are still active, but you don't have a new mission that's launched in 2022. But there were a lot of discussions and updates on what to expect in the coming years. And so maybe just to cover a little bit, to give an overview of what to expect. So in terms of China's lunar program, the next mission is going to be the Chang'e 6. The Chang'e 6 is a sample return mission similar to the Chang'e 5. It's a similar architecture, and that this time is going to the far side of the moon to collect some samples and bring them back to Earth. That's 2024. And then you'll have Chang'e 8, Chang'e 7, Chang'e 8 in 2026, if I'm not wrong. And Chang'e 8, the date is not known, but before 2030, which are two missions to really explore in situ resources utilization. So Chang'e 7 will have a lander, a rover. It'll also have a hopper, sort of small drone that would be hopping around from places that are inaccessible, I guess, to a rover. And in situ resources utilization is important because as China is planning a long-term space station, the ILRS, in the 2030s, it needs to, find ways to not just send things from the Earth all the time, because that's unsustainable, but exploiting, the ice that's at the South Pole of the moon, or, using lunar regolith to extract the oxygen through the metal oxides, or potentially using the regolith for 3D printing, things like that. And so that'll be the big focus of a Chang'e 7 and Chang'e 8. And so after that, there's the ILRS, Sino-Russian in theory. And although the Chinese aren't mentioning the Russians too much in international Congress, to avoid, that's sort of a scarecrow for Western countries. So that's for lunar exploration. If we move on to deep space exploration, Tianwen-1, the Mars mission, was their first successful large-scale deep space exploration mission, launched in 2020 at the same time as Mars 2020, the mission, U.S. mission that carried Perseverance to Mars. Their next one, so you'll have Tianwen 2, 3, and 4. Tianwen will be the common name for planetary missions in the solar system. Tianwen 2 will be a sample return mission on an asteroid, a near-Earth object that's called some 2016 HO3, I think. So that's planned for 2024, 2025. Tianwen-3 is a Mars sample return mission, and it's very interesting, but because it's going to happen at the same time as sort of the Europe-US Mars sample return mission. So in the late 2020s, early 2030s, and you'll have Tianwen-4 for 2030 roughly, which will be a mission to explore the Jupiter system, so Jupiter's atmosphere, but also some of its moons. So that's the sort of the large scale missions, and you have some smaller scale missions that are also currently under discussion.
Anything about asteroid mining? A couple of people want to know.
So asteroid mining. So
Plans.
yeah. So asteroid mining is something that is in discussions in China since many years. It's been a trending topic. And it can go all the way back to the late 1970s. So in the late 1970s, we're still in the early days of the Chinese space program, and China has just 8 years prior launched its first rockets, and it's only starting to get into geostationary satellites. So we're still very early stage, and you have the U.S. the Carter administration in 1978. That gives a piece of a lunar sample from Apollo 17. And so the Chinese are fascinated by this sample. I guess it's maybe 1 gram. It's very little, but they break it into little pieces. They study it, and they're fascinated by the content that they find. And so in the 80s, we're in a period also where the world is making strides in nuclear fusion technology, and the understanding that helium-3 is going to be an important resource for nuclear fusion. And this is a resource that's very rare on Earth. However, it's pretty much abundant on the moon, notably because there's no atmosphere. And so you start hearing voices of, maybe it's worth looking at lunar exploration missions because there could be resources there that could be interesting. And you have sort of the father of the Chinese lunar program, a guy called Ouyang Ziyuan. He's 80 or 90 years old today, but he was one of the early vocal people who were pushing towards a lunar program. But we're in their 80s and the 90s, and so China's space program is still in an early stage, and so priority was given to developing more sophisticated rockets, starting the crewed spaceflight program in 1992, things like that. And in the 1990s, I think it's also a period where we get a more firm understanding of the presence of water on the South Pole, of the ice, the South Pole and the lunar South Pole. That's another resource because water is potentially drinking water. It's also something that can produce oxygen for astronauts. Right. It's something that can produce hydrogen, which is potentially a rocket fuel. And so, again, another type of resource. And so in the early 2000s, that's when China puts together its lunar program and all those Chang'e missions. I think one of the reasons was because there's an understanding that there are lunar resources, there are resources in space. You have other space powers that are active in this domain. And if so, sort of explaining their point of view here, if China is not active at an early stage, it won't be part of the countries that's going to be defining the best practices and the norms of not necessarily asteroid mining, but just how to deal with space resources and deconflicting situations. And so even today there's no I'm not an expert on this, but I don't think there's a clear business case yet for asteroid mining. It's probably more of a medium long-term thing. So you don't have you have one commercial company that's called Origin Space, 起源太空 in Chinese, and they're focusing, well, they're sure their long-term objective is space mining, although what they're doing now, I think, is more commercializing services like space survey telescopes and capturing orbital debris in Earth orbit and deorbiting them, sort of like getting rid of space trash. And I think that's also technology building blocks to capture asteroids potentially in the future. Right. So you have that company, but mostly it's something and I think it's the same outside of China as well. It's not something that has a clear business case, I think, today. And so a lot of it is happening through state-owned and state-led programs. And so you have, the asteroid sample return mission that I was mentioning just now. There's an interest in understanding the composition of asteroids naturally. There's also the fact that it's near-Earth objects. So there's also planetary defense that's worth studying with such an asteroid. So yeah, short answer, there is some long-term projects going on. Not that many commercial, but it's more state-owned companies. You do see the commercial sector though looking into this long-term.
Great answer. And I think we'll wrap it up here and end on this comment. I think bringing the PRC space program to light is very important. Positive, negative, neutral. It's important to acknowledge their accomplishments and how it will affect the world. Knowledge is power.
And I mean, I definitely agree with that, and I think that's the whole goal of DongFang Hour. It's really increasing the awareness on the Chinese space sector and really sticking to the facts, because I see, I'm not going to name them, but there are some very clickbaity space themed channels that are, their titles are like, NASA shocked by this latest Chinese rocket, and it's just absolute BS. And so, I mean, clickbait, there's a lot of clickbait around the Chinese space sector. And although, I mean, this is probably detrimental to my views and my followers on YouTube, I try to stick as much as possible to the facts and try to provide something that's fairly neutral, as I do follow. As sort of a Westerner that's been to China, I try to provide that approach.
Well, if you want just the facts, do you want to tell people to subscribe in Chinese?
请大家关注我的 YouTube. There you go.
I love it. No, I think it's fascinating. That's awesome.
And I also want to thank you also for inviting me, because a lot of my subscribers, as mentioned, I think not all, but a lot of them still have some sort of Chinese background or at least non-Western background. And I think YouTube doesn't do a very good job of suggesting my videos to Western space enthusiasts. So yeah, really appreciate that you invited me. I think you're doing also a great job of I watched a couple of others of your interviews, and I think it's a fascinating thing to bring sort of the space tuber community together. And yeah.
Well, there's so much going on. So, I mean, there's no shortage of things to cover. There's actually too much to cover.
For sure. I mean, that's probably one of the reasons why I focus only on the Chinese space sector. It's almost a full-time job just to follow what's going on in China, and I'm doing this part-time. So it's a bit exhausting at times, but I would want to maybe, if ever this becomes a full-time thing, to maybe cover other countries, like typically the Indian space program, the Japanese space program, what's going on also in around the UAE also is starting to have space activities. There are things to cover outside of Europe and of North America that are also worth mentioning. Yeah,
absolutely. Well, thank you so much for spending time with us, and I think we'll wrap it here. So to everyone who tuned in, thank you. Sorry that the Wi-Fi was kind of spotty and my background isn't great, but I'm still in Florida, so I'm making do with what I have. But thank you to everyone, and we hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Awesome. All right.